David New is responsible for the design of harvesting processes for Mexico's largest teak plantation owner. David will introduce the panel.
Thanks, Tom. It's a privilege to be up here again, and particularly to introduce the panelists that we've assembled to talk about the true cost of wildfire. We're going to start that discussion this morning. We're very, as I said, for me, it's an honor to have a friend here with it representing the Idaho Department of Lands, David Groeschl. Just a little bit about his background. David earned his bachelor's degree in forest management from the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point and a master's degree in forestry from Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia. The Department of Lands in 2008 as the Division Administrator of Forestry and Fire, and in October 2011, David was officially designated Idaho's State Forester. In addition to being the State Forester, David has appointed as the Deputy Director of IDL in July of 2016. As Deputy Director of State Forester, David oversees 3 divisions, including operations, forestry and fire, and lands and waterways. This includes the all endowment and regulatory programs at 2 state staff offices and operations staff located in 14 different field districts across Idaho. David also represents the state of Idaho on several national and state organizations that deal with forestry-related policy and management issues. Prior to joining IDL, David was the Forest Management Bureau Chief of the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation from 2004 to 2008. His broad and extension forestry experience over the last 30 years includes work for the private, industrial, and public forestry sectors, as well as 3 different geographic regions of the country, the South, the Lake States, and the West. So please join me in welcoming David here this morning.
Thank you, David, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I do have a confession, though. When I was asked to be a presenter here, I was very hesitant to commit to being a presenter, and I started to think why, and it came to me. My kids and I have 2 favorite movies that we like to watch. One is Shrek, and one is The Princess Bride. And so in the movie Shrek, if you remember, the ogre and the donkey are walking together and talking, and the ogre says, "Donkey, ogres are like onions." And the donkey shoots back and says, "You mean stinky and smelly?" And the ogre says, "No, no, donkey." He says, "Onions have layers. Ogres have layers." This topic has lots of layers. And so when you think about the topic of changing climate, and I think about all the tentacles and aspects of it, and I think from the national and international policy debates that go on about greenhouse gases, and we talk about cap and trade programs, and we talk about renewable energy type of sources, wind, solar, geothermal, and that there are a lot of tentacles, but I have to think about it from the Department of Lands perspective and ask myself, how does changing climate and how does this topic affect what we do in our mission with the Department of Lands? And some of you in the audience may not know, well, what does the Department of Lands really do? What is your mission? Well, we have 2 primary missions at the Department of Lands. One is our endowment trust land mission. We manage about 2.5 million acres of endowment trust lands that were granted to the state upon statehood in 1890. The express mission of those endowment trust lands is to maximize long-term revenue to the endowments. The largest endowment is K through 12 public education. So the revenue that's generated from the management of those endowment trust lands is distributed to the beneficiaries, the largest being K through 12 public education here in Idaho. Our second mission or focus is really an assistance and protection type of mission. And that is we help, we have various assistance and protection programs within the Department of Lands, like our Forestry Assistance Program, which helps small woodland owners, gives them access and helps develop plans for the management of those lands, helps them access potential grant monies to help manage their forest lands. We also have mining regulatory function. We also have the public trust or navigable waterways responsibilities here in the state, as well as fire protection on about 6.3 million acres. So I had to take this topic and say, how are we incorporating the issue of climate change in the management and our programs that we are responsible for here in Idaho? So I'm going to touch on 3 areas. First is our endowment trust land program, especially related to forest lands. The second one is our fire protection program, where we are responsible for protecting 6.3 million acres of state and private forest lands here in Idaho. And our third one is our cooperative work with the federal government, the Forest Service in particular, in helping increase the pace and scale of forest restoration on federal lands here in Idaho through Good Neighbor Authority. And I'll touch on that in a little bit as well. First, our endowment trust lands. So in 2009, we developed our Forest Asset Management Plan. It was the first time we ever did a real formal asset management plan looking at our forest trust lands. Out of the 2.5 million acres of endowment trust lands, about 1 million acres of that is forested. We are responsible for calculating a sustained yield about every 5 years and managing those lands in perpetuity based on that sustained yield. So as we started to look at what our new sustained yield would be on those forested trust lands, we had to take several things into account. One of them is the impacts of the changing climate. So we started reviewing various, whatever the best available science was. We actually brought in various speakers on the topic within the department. And we also looked at various climate vegetation models, both nationally, regionally, and as you can imagine, there were discrepancies on what they were predicting as far as the changes in forest vegetation. We understand, at least from our standpoint, we've seen more weather extremes. We've seen longer fire seasons. Our fire seasons are now about 30 days longer. And the precipitation, as far as you heard from previous speakers, the form, the amount, and the timing. For example, when we look at our snow-tell sites and we evaluate the snowpack, the moisture content within the snowpack, we also look at how quick that snowpack is coming off. And what we are seeing on average is that snowpack is coming off about a month earlier than it has been historically. So that affects soil moisture. That also affects our forest management as well as we look at it. We had to say, okay, the climate vegetation models, there's some variation in that. So what do we do? How do we address changing climate when it comes to forest management? So our focus was how, with knowing that, how do we reduce the risk to those assets, to those forests? Because we have a fiduciary obligation to the beneficiaries to maximize long-term revenue. But as part of that, it's reducing the risk of loss, both to fire, to insect and disease, to wind throw, and to other weather extremes. So what is it that we built into our last forest asset management plan and that we continue to look at over time? Because we are long-term managers. We look at it, our models, we look at 100-year models as we manage our forests. So what are some of the things that we're doing? One, we are shortening our rotation lengths. You may ask, why? Because the longer you grow the forest, the greater the risk of loss. And what we are seeing when we look at the area burned by fire, we are seeing greater areas burn, and we are seeing increased loss due to wildfire, but we are also seeing increased loss due to greater insect and disease activity out there. The other thing that we realize is over time, and most foresters can tell you this, is internal decay starts to ramp up at about age 60. Just like any biological entity, myself included, I could tell you my internal decay has ramped up significantly. When I was 30 years old, my internal decay was much less, but as I get older, it has accelerated. The same is true with a tree that is a living biological entity. As the internal decay starts to ramp up somewhere around age 60 and increases rapidly as you get towards 100 years old. So it's that risk of loss. So we started to shorten our rotation lengths on our forests on endowment trust lands. The other thing that we did was look at density. Why? Because density, forest density, that means the number of trees you have growing on a certain area, on a per acre area, let's say. If the climate models are suggesting on some aspects that it's going to be hotter and drier, and that there may be some species shifts, both in elevation and in aspect. So north and east facing aspects are usually your wetter, deeper developed soils, your more productive sites. But what we're seeing from some of the models is that those sites that hotter, drier may creep around more onto those north and easterly aspects, as well as elevation-wise. So how does that affect us in how we do forest management? Thinning the forest reduces the amount of water uptake and transpiration that's going on that site, especially if soil moisture becomes limiting. We have to limit the number of trees that we can grow on a per acre basis. We also are looking at the species composition. So what we are finding out is that our seral species, the more sun-loving, earlier successional species, our larch, our Doug fir, our white pine, our ponderosa pine, are more resilient to insect and disease versus the more shade-tolerant species that tend to grow up underneath, grand fir, alpine fir, cedar, are more susceptible to root rot and insect and disease. So we're looking at our species mix as well. We're also looking at our seed zones. So we work with the University of Idaho and their tree improvement program. And as we look at changing climate over time, we look at where we collect our seed from and where we put those seedlings back on the ground will likely shift up in elevation over time. So where we would collect seed at one elevation, let's say 3,000 feet, and try to plant within that zone, because that's what it was adapted for, if temperatures and soil moisture changes, now we may be planting up to 4,000 or 4,500 feet because of those changes. So we're looking at our seed zone placement. So those are some of the things that we look at in our endowment forest land management program to reduce risk of loss over time to those forests. Now I'm going to shift gear to our fire protection program, where we protect 6.3 million acres, as I mentioned earlier. One of the, I noticed the topic was the true cost of wildfire. We provide that protection on 10 districts across the state and 2 timber protective associations. What we have noticed, as I mentioned earlier, is that our fire seasons are about 30 days longer than historically. They're also becoming more expensive. Our 10-year average about 10 years ago was about $7 to $8 million a year fire suppression costs on that 6.3 million acres. That's just IDL's protection. That is not on the federal protection, BLM or Forest Service, just IDLs. Our 10-year average now is about $22 to $23 million a year because of longer fire seasons, just normal increased cost of doing business, but also just the types of resources that we are using today as well when we see the expansion of homes into the forest, into the wildland urban interface. There are several factors that are driving that cost up. We are also looking at, in the past, where we have agreements in place with other states where we share resources during the fire season. So a lot of times that would work very well because their fire season occurred at a different time than our fire season. But what we're seeing is that our fire seasons are starting to overlap more. So there's a shortage of resources at times during critical times during the fire season. Where we used to bring resources in from Canada and Alaska because their fire season would occur earlier. Now their fire seasons, as you may recall, this year in Alaska and Canada, were overlapping for 6 weeks to 2 months with ours, when we could count on bringing those resources down. Then what we would do is share our resources with them early in the fire season when we didn't have as great a need. And that helped us all out. We were good neighbors with one another in doing that. So what are some of the things that we're trying to do to address this longer fire season associated with the changing climate that we're seeing out there? As we assess our fire program, we're looking at ways to, again, manage the risk and looking at our response. So our response, our goal is to try to capture those fires, 94% of them at 10 acres or less, because when you start talking significant fires with the amount of fuel out there and homes in the wildland-urban interface, our goal is to try to get them out as quickly as possible to reduce the risk and loss of life and structures. That's first and foremost for us. So we look at our staffing levels. Are we staffed correctly? We made a shift here a couple of years ago where we had a certain complement of our seasonal firefighters. And what we were noticing is we were losing our firefighters because our seasons are extending longer into the fall. We were losing our firefighters at a critical time, our seasonal firefighters. They were going back to school, usually in mid-August, early September. And our fire season used to wrap up around mid-September. Now it's wrapping up around mid-October to early November. And so what we had to do is shift our hiring practices and where we focused our recruitment efforts for those seasonal firefighters. We're also looking at expanding our resources, not necessarily hiring more fire staff, because you staff up for what's called most efficient level, which is just above the average 10-year average. If you try to staff up for worst case scenario like we had in 2015, you will break the bank. That was our most expensive fire season at about $74 million just on state protection. That was a record year. You can't staff for worst case. But what we realized is we needed to have the capacity, staff at most efficient level to respond to an average fire season. But then how do we build capacity that we can ramp up very quickly and efficiently to address that fire risk out there? So some of the things that we're doing there is pre-positioning resources in areas. We're much quicker now to pre-position resources, IDL resources, federal resources, and contracted resources in areas where we know fronts are moving through, so that we have adequate resources to respond quickly for initial attack to keep the fire small. Second thing we are doing is working with our fire service organization, that's the rural fire departments, and that in helping train them for why most of them are trained for structure protection, but many of them have expressed a willingness to also help out on wildland fire protection as well. So we are working with them, getting them the training and resources that they need. The other area is the Rangeland Fire Protection Associations here in southern Idaho with ranchers. Ranchers know the ground. They have a keen interest in protecting their livelihood. So we've teamed up with the BLM to help form those Rangeland Fire Protection Associations to respond quicker. We're also looking at technology, things like drones to reduce costs, and using drones for fire intel and sizing up fires and knowing how we can deploy our resources most effectively. The other thing that we are doing is working jointly when you talk about protecting the resource out there from fire, we're looking at joint landscape projects like the Paradigm Project here in southern Idaho with the BLM and private ranchers. And that is breaking up big contiguous rangeland fuels and trying to block that up more, break it up more so that we can respond more effectively and efficiently together. The other thing is fire prevention and education with homeowners. When they decide to build in the forest, what can they do to make their home more safe and fire-wise and more resilient against fire on the landscape out there? The third and final area I will touch on, and by the way, when you talk about the true cost of wildfire, there's a publication by the Council of Western State Foresters and Western Forestry Leadership Coalition that's titled that, The True Cost of Wildfire. It's not just the suppression costs. Suppression costs this year were about $22 million. There have been a number of studies done to try to capture the true cost of wildfire, meaning the impacts to the ecosystem services and to people's resources, to the resources out there, to their homes, to the tax base, and they have come in at 2 to 30 times the suppression costs. So when you talk about the true cost of wildfire here in Idaho, and you talk about suppression costs being $23 million this year, what they're indicating is that the true cost or impact to those wildfires with release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the impacts to watersheds and the other ecosystem services is somewhere in the neighborhood of 46 to 30 times that amount, or 600 million. So 40 to $600 million, somewhere in there is the true cost of wildfire. The third area that we were working, I wanted to highlight this morning, was our work with our federal partners on federal lands here in Idaho. And it's under the authority that was granted in the 2014 Farm Bill. It's called Good Neighbor Authority, and that's what allows the states to enter into cooperative agreements with our federal partners to help get work done on federal lands and across ownership boundaries to get landscape benefits out there. So one of the things that we've been doing since 2014 is working with the Forest Service on looking at how we can help increase the pace and scale of forest restoration. So let me put this into context. Our federal agencies, the Forest Service manages 20.4 million acres of forest lands here in Idaho. That is 75% of the forested landscape. Of that 20.4 million acres of forested landscape that they manage, about 12.6 million of that is suitable for some level of management within their forest plans. That's what they have identified. Of the 12.6 million acres, 8.8 million acres has been identified through the collaboratives, through the insect and disease assessment that has been done, 8.8 million acres at high risk to insect and disease mortality. So the first time in what's called FIA history, forest inventory and analysis data that's been collected since the 40s, it's remeasured every 5 to 10 years here in Idaho. First time in history where mortality has exceeded 50% of gross growth here in Idaho. That reflects the amount of fuel, that reflects the forest health concerns here. Both our federal partners, the state, local communities, all have an interest in increasing the pace and scale of forest restoration here in Idaho. So that's the goal in us working cooperatively with them to try to address the forest health concerns, to reduce the fuels on federal lands, to protect communities, and to create jobs. By one of the goals of GNA here in Idaho is to be self-sustaining, meaning here in Idaho, we're blessed with good markets, good forest product markets. So what we're trying to do with them is identify projects that we can do that are revenue generating projects, meaning timber sales, stewardship type of projects that actually generate revenue by selling those products, and then using that revenue to get non-revenue restoration work done on the ground. meaning hazardous fuel treatments and thinning of small trees. It means watershed restoration by addressing sediment issues or legacy road issues, or putting large organic debris into those watersheds to improve fish habitat. There are a number of restoration objectives that they have. Their mission is different than the endowment mission. They're a multiple use mission. And what we want to do is to help them to achieve their mission and to increase that pace and scale of restoration on federal lands here in Idaho. How does that relate to this whole changing climate issue here? Again, forests touch every part of our life. They capture carbon, which is a greenhouse gas, and it's important because they're an element in some of the cap and trade type of programs. The other issue here is we talk about water. Much of our water flows from our forests. Both the quality of the water and the quantity of the water that flows from our forests impact us here in Idaho. And so, again, density, the amount of forest cover, the health of that forest cover, if it's more susceptible to wildfire and the impacts of hot catastrophic wildfires, then we have the impacts to those watersheds and the amount of carbon released in the atmosphere. So it all ties together. And those are some of the things that we're doing at the Idaho Department of Lands. You know, you hear the term, think globally, act locally, and that's what we're attempting to do. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And please, just as a reminder, we're going to try to have time for a few questions, or at least a couple at the end. If you have those, please write them down, and the organizing committee will make sure to pick them up. Our second speaker, and again, a very dear personal friend we're very fortunate to have here with us today, is Vincent Corrao. Vinny, as he's known to his friend, is the president of Northwest Management in Moscow, Idaho. He's a natural resource consulting firm with offices in Idaho, Washington, and Montana. Vincent is an SAF certified forester and is a member of the Association of Consulting Foresters and an environmental management system lead auditor and past president of the Western Forestry Conservation Association. NMI has 43 full-time staff and 5 offices serving the Inland West. NMI has provided consulting services to the Northwest for over 33 years and has been involved in many facets of the forest land management. Primarily responsibilities of Vinny include company growth opportunities, new project development, and financial management of the operations. Vincent participated as a team member of the 3rd National Indian Forest Management Assessment Team and been involved in the implementation of the Anchor Forest concept, where cooperation of multiple landowners in a geographic area, this is in the state of Washington, to provide a long-term sustainable wood supply in maintaining existing infrastructure and providing stability to the local community. Then he lives in Moscow, Idaho, where Northwest Management is home and is located, and enjoys hiking, bird hunting, and fishing here in the Northwest. Vinny, please join me in welcoming Vinny.
Thank you, David. And I want to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity to come and present. One of the things that David asked me to talk about particularly was the private sector. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the industry and the family forest owners. That group together is about 18 million acres in the state of Idaho. Northwest Management has the great opportunity with where we are in the state to work with silviculture, dealing with climate change, what folks do with their forest. We have a lot of carbon projects. We have hydrologists. We deal with water issues. We work a lot with the tribes. And one of the things I'd like to say, because I did work for the Nez Perce tribe for 10 years and have worked with the tribes for over 30 years, is one of the comments that a Nez Perce elder shared with me when we did the National Indian Assessment, was that fish grow on trees. which to me really brings in the whole concept. So in this first slide, I just want to show there's a lot of issues that we've already talked about, dealing with smoke and change and the things that are dear and near to our heart. So the things we need to do today that we've looked at a lot in the industry is that we need to adapt. You've already heard that from many speakers. Communication, obviously so important, and we need to educate if we're going to address these issues for tomorrow. Let's talk a little bit about the arena. We all know there's political and management conflicts, legal challenges that impact our ability to get these things done. Sometimes low return on investment, which means that there's land conversion. Land is going out instead of being an open space. We have the catastrophic incidents with insects and disease, this growing uncertainty with climate change, what we're going to do. And we also have an urban population that isn't really connected to what's going on in forest management and with the resources. So who's affected? We have multiple generations that have a large diversity of interest, a diversity of different experiences, and a common goal that something is needed. And this goes across the industry, the recreational folks, and then the impacts of wildfire, as David just brought up, through the state. So who are the players? We have a lot of players in this industry, and they're already actively engaged. We have the scientists, the practitioners, of course, the landowners that I just brought up, and of course, the policymakers, the managers, and the users. And all of those folks are connected to the forest, some of them in their day-to-day work, some of them in recreation, and some of them just where they live. There's a strong connection to the forest. It's what we are for those that live and breathe the air we use. So David talked about the 8.8 million acres in Idaho that are federal, but over the whole lower 48, there's 70 million acres that have been identified that need some form of treatment. And there's the need for good water, clean water, safety and protection from wildfires, a desire to keep the forest green for other uses, a drive to conserve places and the organisms, and there's a hope that somehow we're going to pull this all off. Now, we do have an advantage. We have the knowledge, the skills, and the ability from our natural resource managers, our foresters, our biologists, ecologists, hydrologists, and the entire environmental community has been working diligently, especially the last 10 years, to deal with these issues. The reality of now is what has happened then. And what I mean by that, we've had 30 to 40 years of intense fire suppression. We've had a minimal amount of activity on much of our, particularly federal lands. And really what we want is a green forest, and in many folks, old growth forest. What we have is a very dense, overstocked, in many cases, second growth, what we call second growth timber, that is dying rapidly and resulting in wildfire. So as those fires come over the hill, what can forestry and what we already know, what can they provide? We do have a comprehensive understanding of the entire forest ecosystem, not just the trees. We understand water, soil, disturbance, growth, succession, the products and the values that we can do from the forest, and the recreation and social value. We often talk about the three legs of the stool, dealing with social, cultural, environmental, and economic. And we are starting to understand in many places that have lost their infrastructure that without the milling and processing infrastructure, it's very difficult to do the treatments we need. We have great examples of successful best management practices. As an auditor for almost 20 years, I've been in 23 different states and 6 Canadian provinces. And the forest management and the stewardship that is now being practiced is far exceeds when I started as a forester almost 40 years ago. And we have modifications now coming with carbon policies that do address the human influences on our forest. And it's starting to push us now toward more of a landscape scale address, because ownership, you know, the creeks cross ownerships, they cross drainages. And so for societal benefits, we're starting to look at a landscape base. Just one of the things I wanted to show here from the National Interagency Fire Center is that, you know, we monitor on a monthly basis the change in vegetation moisture content so that we can actually predict the fires, red being the driest areas. This was in July of this year. And we all want to be prepared so that you don't have to be in the situation that this homeowner was. So we have opportunities to educate ourselves and to educate others to create a defensible space, because damage to homes and to your personal property is a reality, particularly in the inland west. So when the fire comes over the hill, and this is the result, which will happen in a lot of the inland west, we need to be prepared. Defensible space plans on the private landowner side is an educational process that's promoted throughout most of the states. We do a lot of these plans for landowners, as well as the treatments, to try to help give them the defensible space to protect their home and their property, but also for the firefighters to have a place to safely work if they're going to try to protect your home. So there's a series of things from cleaning the burnable debris, cleaning what we call the ladder fuels, which is the branches that go up the tree, clean around your home so that you can protect your home from the inevitable wildfires that I think a lot of the folks in California, which is a very common occurrence there, but it's still been a hard sell to get the landowners to understand that without a defensible space plan, it's very difficult for the firefighters to protect your home. So in the sea of green, you need to know the risk, and the risk, particularly in the Northwest, our highest risk is going to be wildfire and all the impacts dealing with wildlife, habitat, water, smoke, particulate matter, all those issues that many of the speakers have already talked about. We are starting to talk about the risk. And we have to plan for the event, because the event is going to happen. For the first time in California, we had homes near Sonoma and whole communities that burned that historically in the fire plans that were written for those communities said would not happen. So we need to manage our actions. And there are options for the landowners, both large and small, to lessen the risk of damaging wildfires. You're not going to be able to take it 100% away, but you can lessen that risk and take the risk down, and there are working solutions. I'm not going to talk too much about the Good Neighbor Authority because David already mentioned that, but that has been a very successful program cooperating with the Forest Service to get treatments done that not only protect homes and communities through the, treating those acres next to communities, but also to get more acres done so that we can have less resource damage. On the federal side, we also have stewardship contracting, which has been very successful. Those are up to 10-year contracts where we can do treatments on federal land. But the tribes have initiated what's called the anchor forest concept. This is a multi-jurisdictional initiative where the tribe would work with the states and the federal lands across the ownerships so that they could address air quality, water quality, soil protection, wildlife habitat, and participate as a cooperative group in getting what's needed and what can provide the most societal benefits. And then on the private side, again, David mentioned Idaho Firewise is a very active program for private landowners to try to protect their homes as they move forward. So a few things. As foresters, in the long term, we understand sustainable forest management, and it is a strategy to increase the forest carbon stocks while producing annual sustainable yields of fiber and energy from the forest, and this will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. Now, this came from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That was reported in 2007. The next statement, we must work toward a shared vision, a vision that conserves our forest and vital resources important to survival, while wisely respecting the need of the forest and the economy to create jobs and vibrant rural communities. That was from our Agriculture Secretary, Vilsack, back in 2009. So we're working on the problem. People have identified the problem, but as society, we do struggle with how we're going to get this done. So I'd like to come back to the 3 points. We need to adapt to these changing times, because if there's one thing that's true in the forest is there will be change. And the climate initiative has accelerated that in many areas of our forest. We need to communicate what we think those changes are and what maybe the low-hanging fruit that we should be attacking right now that our keynote speaker already brought up. And then we do need to educate, because a lot of these are political issues, and they're issues that are going to need to be addressed more than just within one landowner or even within multiple landowners. So in closing, this is just paraphrase from Thomas Jefferson. The only way to get somewhere you have never been is to do something you've never done.
Thank you, Vinny. And again, if you have any questions and cards, please hold them up and let Bass or Emily or one of our organizers see it. We're also very, we talk about benefits of Idaho. One of the best benefits of Idaho is that we are one of the few states, and they're primarily in the western U.S., that actually has a number of sector commissions that actually support those sectors in a variety of different ways. And we're very fortunate here today to actually have Gretchen Hyde, who is the director of the Idaho Rangeland Resource Commission. She has a very extensive background, and in terms of the sector that she represents, that are often what I call and I say this having been one of myself, the sort of silent ag and rangeland folks that are often kind of left out of some of these meetings in the past. And we were very fortunate today to be able to have folks that have joined us from that sector, both here in Boise, but also in Pocatello and Moscow especially, and actually in Ashton. Gretchen grew up on a family farm and ranch north of Emmett. She attended the University of Idaho and graduated from Boise State University with a Bachelor of Arts in accounting. She worked at AgriBeef as the controller of the livestock division for 7 years prior to becoming the executive director. In fact, the first is the only, isn't it, I guess, with the founding director of the Idaho Rangeland Resource Commission in 1997. This rancher-led state commission was the first state agency in the nation which works collaboratively to provide proactive education and outreach campaigns on rangeland issues. The Idaho Rangeland Commission co-hosts teacher workshops, develops classrooms and field trip lessons and activities for students, sponsors 4-H and FFA activities, and provides outdoor learning events, created the Care Share campaign and the award-winning Life on the Range online videos. So please join me in welcoming Gretchen here this morning.
Well, nothing like being the last speaker before lunch, but I really appreciate the opportunity. And I also appreciate the opportunity to be on stage with foresters. Rangeland is kind of forgotten, and a few of you in the room have been really key in the success of the Rangeland Resource Commission. Partnerships are everything, and the Idaho Forest Products Commission kind of led the way into the formation of the Idaho Rangeland Resource Commission 20 years ago. I did grow up on a ranch, and in 1986, I graduated from high school, and that summer, my dad's complete ranch burned from end to end, every single corner. It was the year of the dairy buyout. It was just a devastating year. And at that time, my dad said, go do anything but this. Get away from the ranch. And unfortunately, I had a tough time doing that. So I did get a degree in accounting, but I have a passion for range. I love the land, recreation, just understanding the ecology. I wish I would have spent a little more time at U of I and pursued that. But I've had a great opportunity to work with several of you in the room and diverse backgrounds, and that's really what this is all about. People getting together and talking about solutions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I have to give a little shout out to University of Idaho students watching. My son is actually taking a class on climate change, and is Luke, hello. Go Vandals. So I have to give a little background. Everybody knows what a forest is. I've heard the term desert thrown around several times today, and rangeland is our desert, I guess. It's diverse. We have a lot of different types of rangeland in our state, and it does create a lot of difficulties. When you look at this land ownership pattern, you see the complexities of the land. Every rancher has to deal with these complexities. There's only 20% of our rangeland, which is only about half of our state, is privately held. Some of the smarter homesteaders, I guess, found land that they could cultivate and irrigate, but some of our forefathers weren't quite as innovative, or a little tougher, I guess. So that 20% is really critical. That's where the water is, and that ties into the public land management, whether it's BLM or Forest Service or even the state lands. Connecting those landscapes, the interdependence of those landscapes is very critical. Unfortunately, a lot of decisions are made about Idaho that don't come from people in Idaho. This also describes our land ownership patterns. Our precipitation rates are very variable. And when you talk about climate change, ranchers deal with it every single year. The grass grows differently every single year. And so they, when we talk about climate change, it's something they deal with all the time. They don't have the opportunity to irrigate. They don't have an opportunity to fertilize. This is really how it is, and they have to adapt to that every year. Having the ability to adapt is really critical. The other thing is, the West is just very dry. We do have some huge vulnerabilities. And I think a lot of people who move here or visit here, they don't understand, what the heck did you do to this state? Why is it so dry? I actually had a phone call from a lady who moved from northern Idaho to southern Idaho, and she was really upset. She's like, where are all the trees on the Boise foothills? And, you know, I mean, it's true. We kind of get in our own little bubble. We forget how these systems all work. I said, well, how long have you been here? 12 inches of rain does not grow trees, I hate to say. And we live in places, rangeland is basically areas from 8 to 20 inches of rain. That is not a lot. Think about what you could do with your own landscape with that. So those are the limitations of what ranchers have to deal with, and rangeland managers. This map has been used, and I think it really tells the story why Idaho is on the forefront of dealing with wildfire. This area in central Idaho, from here to Mountain Home, has gotten hit with large wildfires year after year after year. There's a lot of reasons for that, but the problem is we've created a cycle that we've got to change. The management has to change, or we're going to continue to see this just explode. We all know what the causes are. I mean, we get a lot of wildfire caused by humans, but those aren't the huge fires. Those are the ones along the freeways, campfire areas. 80% of our starts are human caused. I do think the education and outreach is a really big thing for people to be aware of. But the natural cause, and this is just in the last 4 years, The majority of those fires cause the most acreage. When we have basically lightning storms come through, they hit multiple areas and they're very devastating. So I was going to talk a little bit about my own father's experience. In 1986, he lost his, in 2006, 20 years to the day. He had another same kind of thing. A storm came through and devastated. At that time, it was really frustrating because we had basically wildland firefighters coming in from Utah. And this was in 2006. They wouldn't even speak to my dad. They didn't take time to listen to the man who grew up there to understand where to fight the fire, where were the ways to get to different places. They shut him out. They said, we got it under control. We'll talk to you in the morning. Well, 3 o'clock in the morning, we got a phone call. It took the whole ranch again. I can't explain to you the emotion. So when we talk about the cost of wildfire, this is an emotional thing to these people. The wildland fire safety, you never want to put people at risk. It's not worth it. But it also got to the point where they just were waiting for the fire to come to them. They were at basically at a house, protecting a house. Well, that's insured, that's replaceable. All that grass, it's not replaceable to a rancher. They have to take 2 years afterwards. It's really tough. It's something that devastates a lot of these people. And I'm going to share some pictures with you from the soda fire. Mary Blackstock, she's an amazing photographer, thank goodness, and she was willing to share her photos of the soda fire from her family's perspective. This cheatgrass has changed everything. And these lower elevations, say continuous fuel loads of these annual grasses that grow every single year. We can't just rest them and think, oh, it'll go away. We are encouraging the growth of cheatgrass with our management. So that's really the background. This is a picture that Mary Blackstock took not too long before the soda fire. Look at this landscape. It's beautiful. This is what everybody wants, right? It's managed with grazing. There is so much grass, so much forage, but it also turns into fuel. And these photos, I'm just going to kind of go through them really quickly. She was able to capture quite a few of them. And I can't even imagine the emotion she went through. I know my dad never took one picture. He didn't want to remember it. But when it starts and it comes from different directions and you have a wind and you have these things happen, hundreds of thousands of acres can burn in one day. You can see in there, there's some wildland firefighters. I'm pretty sure I would say it's probably her family. This is scary. That is sagebrush and just grass. These aren't trees. Going through the night, wondering where your livestock is. Protecting your home. And then devastation the next day. We see the fire, and you know, Boise is having to deal with this as well, but you look at that air quality. How is that good for anybody? They didn't lose all their cattle, but they lost a lot. And going out and gathering them, she had pictures of her daughters and her family. And I know Brenda Richards is in the room, and desperation. They care for these animals. This is their livelihood, but they're also, animal husbandry is a big deal. The wildlife impact is hard to even quantify. I don't think we have a clue the impact. We talk about sagegrass, but there are so many other species that live out there. And then the long-term effects. I mean, some of them survived and just had some burns. It's not, but they didn't all survive. And that's really tough. So I want to switch gears into solutions because there are things we can do. We have to change the way we look at this. Grazing is an option to manage fuel loads. It is either fuel or it is forage. We have to look at that as an opportunity. The BLM, the Forest Service, Department of Lands have all worked together to develop a lot of great management plans. And I'm hoping that tomorrow Tim Murphy will be able to share some more of his thoughts. But I will quickly go through, a lot of these solutions have already been discussed. But it is about working together. It's about having a respect for each other. It's about wildlife. It's about recreation. It's about people on the land. And these local communities, the social, the economic, and the ecological are all intertwined. It's really important we think about the whole picture. So I'll quickly go through these, but fuel breaks, it's a really obvious one. We've got roads, use them. Forage kochia, it's a plant that people seem to want to demonize, but it squeezes out cheatgrass, and it's a really great wildlife forage. Manage grazing, having the ability to be controlled fire. We're not going to stop fire with grazing, but we could control it. And then also looking for places for defensible space for wildland fire safety. Public awareness, those 80% that are started by humans, we need to stop them, let people know, remind them. And then Rangeland Fire Protection Associations, those are key points. People have to work together and find solutions. So with that, thank you.
Thanks very much, Gretchen. I think we have time for maybe 2 questions, and boy, we had some great ones. So, please forgive me if we don't get to your question. But the first question here is: if we now recognize that putting out all fires has contributed in part to increased fire intensity, how is continuing to put out 98% of the fires responsive? So what does it say? Responsive to this reality? So I guess I'd ask maybe David and Vinny, Gretchen, because this, a little bit of background maybe to this question. There's David and Vinny both talked about the long history of keeping fires out of forests, which has led actually to the overstocking that we find, particularly in federal forests today. But we also have some changes in the fire management policy, particularly on federal lands, versus the programs that David talked about natural fires. Fire can be very good, but also it can be very disastrous. It becomes a kind of a call, a decision early on in those fires that occurs particularly on public lands about whether they're going to manage it as a natural fire versus coming in and suppressing it. So there's a little bit of background to that question. But David and Vinny, do you want to comment?
Appreciate that question. The statistics I gave about trying to capture 94% of the fires at 10 acres or less was specifically on IDL's protection. We use fire on a regular basis, prescribed fire, under controlled situations to achieve a certain management objective on the landscape, reducing fuel, seedbed preparation for regeneration. So we do use fire, and fire is an important tool. But when you look at IDL's protection area, much of our protection is on the west side of the state. It's in the populated areas where there's homes in the forest. Compared to the federal protection, the Forest Service and the BLM's protection, there's less structures and homes in the forest. So we protect, when you look at the 6.3 million acres, roughly 85% of that is within the WUI, or called Wildland Urban Interface. So those forest landowners and homeowners pay an assessment, and their expectation is that we put the fire out. Now, we put the fire out because of our protection area, but we also recognize fire as a beneficial tool. There's another aspect to this. Fire and active management, the combination is what we believe is the appropriate tools. Harvesting and fire, both on the landscape, help reduce the fuels, maintain healthy forests. So we see a benefit of using fire, but under controlled situations. Letting the fire go, especially in areas where there are homes and structures and where the fuel has built up, can be very disastrous, both to the individuals, to their livelihoods, their homes, but also to the watersheds, the air quality, and all of that. So I don't want you to walk away from here thinking that aggressive initial attack is because we don't believe fire is useful or beneficial on the landscape.
Thank you, David. Vinny, do you want to add anything? This second question, I guess maybe I'd direct towards Vinny. Given the limited number of mills in Idaho, how do we quickly reduce fuels across our forests to reduce fire and smoke impacts?
North Idaho actually has a very strong infrastructure, as David mentioned, and there's at least the understanding is that there could be a lot more wood processed in North Idaho than presently is. Many of the mills are not at maximum production. South Idaho, we're going to struggle with that. South Idaho has lost a lot of the infrastructure here, and without new infrastructure coming in, maybe with new technologies such as cross-laminated timbers or other kind of glue lam type of products, it would be difficult for South Idaho to without new even greenfield infrastructure to treat those, to do the treatments that need to be done here.
Thank you, Vinny. And we'll hear a lot more. Any of you who are joining the breakout session for this both days, we'll hear a lot more about this. So I guess I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists here this morning and this afternoon. And I have one more great pleasurable responsibility here early this afternoon before we break for lunch, and I guess we're just standing between that, is we also have one of our other key sponsors, and Dr. Chuck Staben, the president of the University of Idaho, is going to come up and say a few words. And again, we're very blessed to have Chuck here representing our land-grant university. And thank you very much, Dr. Staben, for joining us this morning.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks to all the organizers and participants. You know, I don't have to tell this audience that climate change is actually quite a contentious issue in the United States. But I think much of that contention centers on whether climate change is caused by humans or not. And in that light, I think the summit organizers were extremely wise to frame this summit primarily in terms of our response to climate change. So although I feel research universities should not shy from addressing the nature and cause of climate change, I think the summit has taken a very pragmatic approach to addressing the issue of sustaining Idaho's economy in light of the change that is occurring. The summit is and should be statewide and collaborative. I appreciate that aspect of it, and welcome to all of those who are in Moscow, Pocatello, and Ashton. The challenge of climate change is a very large one, and I think it's important for us all to collaborate, for our universities to collaborate with one another, and for our universities to collaborate with businesses, industries, and government agencies. So it's great to see all of you represented here. I know that there probably are a few vandals in the audience. Is that a true statement? A few? Okay, great to have you here. And I'll say a little bit about U of I's efforts that I think are relevant to the challenges that we're facing, but recognize that there's a lot of other expertise in the room as well. So as David said, we are Idaho's land-grant university. We're Idaho's premier research university. We have broad and deep capabilities in a number of areas in research. Our mission, really, as a university, derives right from the land-grant vision. And I always love talking about that. I won't say much, but in 1862, I will say that the United States, in a very foresightful way, passed an act to ensure that each state would have a university that could provide education, could conduct research, although they didn't talk too much about it in 1862, and outreach to its citizens. And that's really what land-grant universities do. So education, undergraduate, graduate, and professional, we're Idaho's leader. We, as a land-grant university, should be and are esteemed by the brightest students in our state, but accessible to the poorest. We, in research, should be the state's leader in basic research and in use-inspired research, both. And in outreach, we bring the benefits of that research and education to all the citizens and industries of our state. So I think each and every part of our mission is relevant to the issues that you're discussing at this summit. And I hope that the summit stimulates more of these partnerships between universities and businesses. I want to say a few highlights of what has been and is going on at U of I. I think we've been a leader in climate change research for many years. This is actually the 125th year also, and one of the leading colleges is agriculture. This is actually the 125th year of Idaho's Agricultural Experiment Station. We began operations at our experiment station even before we offered classes at the University of Idaho. Agriculture just completed a $20 million REACH grant from NSF, the largest ever at U of I, the largest in Idaho, and a real leading grant in climate change research. We're extending that work in multiple ways, including, for example, a $3.4 million grant recently awarded to Jody Johnson Maynard, one of our faculty. These grants exemplify top quality, objective research that's closely integrated with graduate education and facilitates outreach as well. Outreach, by the way, I'm sure you recognize, is a strength of U of I and very traditional for a land-grant university. We serve all of Idaho through sites in 42 of Idaho's 44 counties through our agricultural extension network. We're a trusted messenger and partner in Idaho's communities and a very valuable network for Idaho. And I hope you'll think about how you can use that network in the work that you wish to do. We have a diverse portfolio in research in agriculture and other colleges. We are, for example, undertaking an important initiative in our CAFE initiative. If you think about big problems that the world faces, we're going to need to, with the increases in population, we, the world, need to double the food produced in the world by 2050. And that increasing demand for amount and quality, protein, how will we feed the world sustainably and yet maintain the great environment that we enjoy here in Idaho, the wonderful water, the forests, et cetera. So we've undertaken to build the nation's largest and best research dairy to sustain an Idaho industry, to sustain our environment. In natural resources happens to be the 100th year of our College of Forestry and Natural Resources, so another exciting anniversary. Forestry and fire science, you just saw discussed in the session before me. And by the way, I've had the privilege of joining many of the folks up here on a number of tours of Idaho. We just went to the Owyhees and saw some of the ground that was burned that Gretchen, I think, pictured in her presentation on that tour. And it's an extraordinary opportunity to understand Idaho even better. But that college, you can see, will be even more critical as we see conditions that generate wildfire conditions extending longer and posing more dangerous situation. David mentioned the mills up in I think Vinny mentioned, excuse me, some of the mills up in North Idaho and some of the new products we hope to see, like cross-laminated timber coming out, providing with forest products a more sustainable way to address building needs throughout the United States. And I hope soon that you'll see a great example on our campus with a new basketball arena. But we also have research in fisheries and wildlife in Rangeland and in policy. Within our College of Natural Resources, we have our policy analysis group who can be a great partner on work that you need done. I see lots of other issues as I look at your agenda. Certainly our College of Engineering, I think, can contribute in a number of ways. Our College of Engineering has taken a very interesting approach to sort of structuring some of its forward thinking, embracing what is called the National Academy of Engineers Grand Challenges Project. 14 major challenges, including, for example, how we sustain environmental quality in the face of increasing needs that the world has. And it is the only college in a College of Engineering in the Northwest that's actually accepted the Grand Challenges framework throughout the Northwest. College of Science, basic science, but also Center for Modeling Complex Interactions. You see some complex interactions up here. So I want you to think about how you can engage with some of these colleges at the University of Idaho that can help you. Talk in your program about the built environment. We're Idaho's only College of Architecture. We have an urban planning group. The built environment is going to be very important, especially in that urban wildland interface, I suspect. Health. We're Idaho's medical school through the WWAMI program, dietetics, nutrition, and fitness, especially through our College of Agriculture. And outreach. How can you use our 4-H program and our Ag Extension Network to think about bringing the word that you want to the public? Policy, I think you heard a great deal about our McClure Public Policy Center headed by Catherine Hyde. She just joined us. Very pleased to have her on board. And former director Priscilla Salant is sitting out there as well. But a great policy center, and a policy center that can give you access to much of what the University of Idaho has to offer through sort of a hub and spoke model that we see as important to how that center can operate. But that center is right here in Boise and a great access point. So I want you in Idaho to see U of I as a collaborative partner, but also a great one-stop shop for objective research, for effective outreach, for relevant quality education, and of course, as a great partner. Go Vandals, and let's go get some lunch.
Thank you, Dr. Staben. I think we're going to turn Tom back over to you. We probably have a few lunch instructions. I think, as I said, someone from our, how long, Bass, do we have for lunch? Is it what, 1:15? We need to be back here. 1:10, please be back here. We have lunch at the back of the room, and then after lunch, we're going to have some really the fun starts because we're going to get ready for our breakout sessions.